Well, maybe you can relate to some of these questions. Where is God? Where are you, God? What the heck, God? I guess there's no comma there. What the heck, God? Come on, God. Why? Why, God? Really, God? Or God? Exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. Where? Or God, where? Why? Like, have you been there? Have you been there sometimes where you ask God those kind of questions? Maybe you've been there as the call has come in, and the doctor on the other end of the phone has some news that is just heartbreaking, and he uses a word called cancer or a different disease. Your spouse asks you for a divorce. You can't pay your bills, and the pressure on your chest is unreal. Your son is distant. Maybe your daughter was caught lying. Maybe your teenage daughter comes home and tells you she's pregnant. It's a little different than the plan that you guys thought was going to be there. You've asked your spouse to stop drinking, and they won't. You've asked your spouse time and time again to just listen, and they won't. Or to stop with the abuse, and they won't. You love your church, but it seems to be different, and you don't know if you still fit. Your teenager's struggling with panic attacks, or you are struggling with panic attacks. You're depressed, or anxiety has gripped you. Your car always seems to break down. Always. The nearest Chick-fil-A is 81.6 miles from your house. Your football team has never been to the Super Bowl. Like suffering. Now we're talking. I love this quote by Tim Keller. Suffering is unbearable if you aren't certain that God is for you and with you. Suffering is unbearable if you aren't certain that God is for you and with you. Today we talk about suffering. This is not one of those talks that we're oh, we can't wait to hear this. But it's one of those things that we need to dive into. And I'm so glad that our Rooted books spends time on this. Well, welcome to Thrive. My name is Jason Raitz. I'm one of the pastors here. This is your very first time. I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you for filling out the Connect card. Like Jeff said, we would love to get to know you. Last week, our executive pastor, Dave Shepard, kept this series going, and he talked about the ideas, like, can we actually hear from God? Is God still speaking to us? And last week, he did a great job of answering the question, yes, God still speaks with us, and yes, we can learn to listen. And the first week, we talked about how when we're rooted, it gives us this strong foundation. That when these seasons come, the ups and the downs, we have this strong foundation in who God is. And then the second week, we just asked the question, God, who are you? Like, who really are you? Are you this far off God? Do you even exist? What are you all about? And so if you missed those, go to our YouTube channel, type in Thrive Church MI, and you can get caught up on those messages. But before I move on, today, because it's just heavier, and we're talking about suffering and pain, like if you need prayer today, today's the day. Like we'll have people to pray with you. We'll have people in the prayer room to pray with you. And if you're on Facebook right now, watching wherever you're at, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Or if you're a Thriver and you're at home and you couldn't be here, thanks for tuning in. Thank you for all of you for sharing the live feed on your pages, because more and more people get to see what Thrive is all about and hear about Jesus. So thank you. Last thing before we kind of move any further into this, did you know that it's Pastor Appreciation Month? Yeah, give it up for me. No, I'm kidding. It's Pastor Appreciation Month. I know there's an Appreciation Month for everything. You know, it's like Chocolate Appreciation Month, and Chocolate Lab Appreciation Month, and then Chocolate Labs who love Chocolate Appreciation Month. Like, there's an Appreciation Month for everything. But here's what I know. Like, our world is being sucked dry of encouragement and appreciation. The more and more you look online, how people treat each other, the comments, how they respond to each other live, we're just being sucked dry of appreciation and encouragement. And I know in my life, one of my primary roles as your pastor is to stay encouraged. Because I know that there's a very real enemy, which we'll talk about next week in this series. And one of his greatest ways to get me off my game as your pastor is to suck me dry of encouragement. And we talked about love languages last month. One of my top love languages is word. Well, gift is number one. We haven't gotten that hint. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Words, and I know, like, for me, and so I know that there are seasons in all of our lives where we just feel like we're not encouraged. And so my hope to you today is that we all should have an appreciation month for each other. And we should appreciate each other and encourage one another. But before we do that, I just wanted to bring up a couple staff members because I just wanted to make sure you know who some of our folks are, and especially these staff members. I'm not going to bring everybody up, but is Dave Shepard here, our executive pastor? Dave Shepard, if you're here, you could come up on the stage. If you're not here, then you won't be coming up on the stage. Rebecca Raitz, are you in the room? Michaela Grinzinger. Michaela's coming up very slow. I don't purposely pronounce. I think you're the only one. Hi.
I think so too.
It's very nice to see you. This is Michaela. There are 5 of our staff members who some receive some financial support from the church, and then they raise some financial support, and then some raise all of their financial support. And so Michaela is one of those staff members who raises her financial support. And so I just wanted you to know and to show and to tell you like how much we appreciate you and the fact that you're willing to take that step of faith to be able to do that. And what you do and our staff is just super important and powerful. And so if you see her in the hallway, she is raising her support. So I don't know, bless her. Bless her with a $20 bill, maybe a 50. I don't know. It's just crazy. If you got 100, I know nobody carries money, but if you got it. But can you say thank you to Michaela and the rest of our staff this morning? Thank you. So where is God in the midst of suffering? Right off the bat, we're going to go to Philippians 4, 6, and 7, and it's written by a man in the New Testament who experienced just unreal suffering. And he throws us for a loop because the Apostle Paul experienced all the suffering, and never would we thought that he'd throw us for a loop. And this is what it says. This is what he says. He says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Like, that's just crazy talk. Really, Paul? Do not be anxious about anything? Are you kidding me? Like, remember who Paul is writing to. He's actually writing to a church. He's writing to the church of Philippi. And there's a number of things that they're probably worried about. And on the top of that is like Paul, their leader, church planter, missionary Paul, he's in jail. So like he's under house arrest, a courtesy of the Roman Empire. So the church of Philippi had supported his missionary work, and they're concerned for his well-being. So Paul is like, listen, don't be anxious. Then in Philippians 2, we see that there is some disunity in the church, and people were acting selfishly. I know that's like shocking that could actually happen. But Paul needed to say, hey, you need to focus on Jesus' example. And then Philippians 3, there's these people called false teachers, and they were attempting to upset people's confidence in Christ because they're trying to get them to have obedience back to the law, which was the old way, and Jesus came to have a new way. And so finally in Philippians 4, the disunity and the discord had reached a certain point where Paul actually calls out 2 women by name and says, can't you just get along? Can't you just get along? And the solution to the problems over and over is to go to the only one who can actually do something about them. That's the solution. Yet why is it so hard for us sometimes to not do what Paul says here? Paul says, listen, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. Present your request to God. And then the peace of God. Wouldn't you want to experience the peace of God in your life? The peace of God. When we have problems and worries, we often forget to pray about them. Then when we do pray, we may think that the only help that God can give is to grant the exact request that we have presented to him. We think, God, this is the only solution. You gotta do this for me. And I think God's he may very well do that. But guess what? Even though he has the power to change any situation, he's not going to be limited to just what you ask. God does not promise to change every situation to our liking. What he does promise is to give us peace during the situation. In other words, God may or may not change your circumstance, but he will change our dispositions toward it so that it doesn't cause all this inner turmoil. Have you ever lived with inner turmoil? Where it just feels like your soul is just at odds with each other. It's at odds and it's at war. And here's what we need to know about suffering. God is with us in the midst of suffering. God is with us in the midst of suffering. 2005, I left my job as a junior high pastor at a mega church in the Detroit area, and I started this nonprofit ministry called Project 311. We wanted to teach students how to extend God's love. We want to teach students how to live out 1 John 3:11. The message is simple: love one another. And so we started by kicking off our ministry with this big, giant festival, Christian music festival. And for the previous 10 years of ministry, I hosted dozens of concerts, dozens and dozens of concerts. Thousands of students attended. So finally, we get to the point, June 2005, we host this big, giant, I got a picture of it. We host this big, giant festival called Blitz Fest. All these stages and bands and skateboarding and inflatable. I mean, we just had this big giant. We took over this park. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing. The event was just great. I love events. This event was great. The problem with this event, though, is that we needed thousands of people to attend to cover our costs, and hundreds of people came. And a month before we were going to do this event, my partner had to back out of his responsibilities with this event and our ministry. And with him, our financial backing went. And so we were like, do we still go through with this? And we're like, God's leading this. Let's take the step of faith. And on June 5th at 3 a.m., June 3rd at 3 a.m., I'm standing in that field where that stage is. And I'm just screaming at God, those questions that I read in the very beginning. And for the next week of my life, my eyes were constantly blurry. My body felt like I was just being punched all day long. This was before there was a Find an iPhone app, so my wife didn't know where I was. I would just start driving because I couldn't concentrate because my life was falling apart. There was one day I went to a movie theater in Livonia, and I ended up sitting there all day and night. And I didn't even realize it. Like the panic and the anxiety was so great, I just sat there all day. Finally, somebody came in the movie theater and they're like, you've been here all day. And I'm like, what time is it? They're like, it's 11:30. I'm like, I didn't even know. I was humiliated. Our event failed. I was desperate. We owed thousands and thousands of dollars to vendors. And to be honest, I contemplated ending my life. I hit the bottom that hard. And on top of that, I was the laughing stock of pastors and ministry leaders in the Detroit area at that point. I was the butt of jokes. And I wondered if God was real. God, like, we're doing this whole event so we could tell people about you. Like, why would it fail? And I wondered, God, where were you? Like, were you really there in the midst of my suffering? Here's a few things we got to understand about suffering and pain. I love this quote by Helen Keller. The world is full of suffering. It is also full of overcoming it. That's good. Mark Twain said, there's been much tragedy in my life. At least half of it actually happened. Yeah, that's true as well. Life can be full of wonderful adventures and joy, but we all know it. There's pain, there's suffering, there's heartbreak, there's disappointment, there are broken relationships, there is crime, there is abuse, there's victimization, there's even death. Even Jesus himself in John 16:33 warned us about this. He said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. You are going to have tribulation. But Jesus doesn't really get to address the question, why? And that's the question that's on so many people's minds since the beginning of time. Why is there pain? Why is there suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people? It's gone back to the beginning of everything. We see it in the Old Testament. It was the cry on the lips of Job. Why is there suffering? You can read the Psalms and you see the psalmists talk about suffering. And then you look at the last century, you look at all the pain and the suffering that we've experienced on this planet. We've seen all this stuff, and this world wants to know why pain, why suffering. George Barna, whose organization is a kind of a Christian pollster survey, he asked the question: if you could ask God any question that you know God would give you an answer, what would you ask? And the number one question people said was, why is there suffering in this world? So right off the bat, let's lay the foundation for this. Here it is. God is not the creator of suffering. God is not the author of evil and suffering. God is not the creator and author of this. Genesis 1:31, after he made everything, he actually said, God saw that he had made, and it was very good. He saw all that it was made. God is not the creator of evil and suffering. This answers the question you hear so often of why didn't God create a world where there was no evil and suffering in the first place? So here's the question. If God is not the author of evil and suffering, And if what God was created good, where did all this evil come from? And the with that has to do with the fact that God in his wisdom decided to give human beings free will. And why did he give human beings free will? Because the greatest value in the universe is love. To love God, to love people. Love is the highest value. And the only way that the highest value of love can really be attained is if we have free will. Then we can make the choice to love or not to love, because true love must involve a choice. It's kind of like going into a toy store and you see a doll and you pull a little thing on the back. My family just watched Toy Story 4, and so we were kind of watching that. And if you pull the string and the doll says, "I love you," does that doll really love you? No, of course not. It's programmed to say it loves you. It has no choice. It must say it. That's not love. For you to really express love, you must be able to make another choice. You must be able to make the choice not to love in order for your expression of love to be true. And God, knowing this, created a world in which he gave human beings that free will. The problem is, though, we've abused that free will and we've rejected God and we've walked away from him and his ways, and the result has been the introduction of two kinds of evil into this world: moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil we see in Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Moral evil. Then natural evil. Romans 8:22. For we know that up to the present time, all of creation groans with pain like that of childbirth. The first is moral evil. Moral evil is the immorality and the pain and the suffering that results when we make selfish and arrogant and uncaring and abusive decisions. Romans 3:23 makes it clear. All have sinned. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God. Therefore, we've all done things out of our free will that have resulted in hurt to ourselves and other people. And in fact, most authors that I've read on pain and suffering, some hint to up to 95% of the suffering in this world is the result of ourselves and our poor decisions and other people. The second kind of evil is called natural evil. Things like earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, snow apocalypses, country music, cats, things like that. Notice I didn't say camping, all right? And there's a lot of hubbub going on in my life right now because the new Hootie and the Blowfish album is dropping. And many people say it sounds like country. You know what? Over here, enough, all right. It's not super country, Matt Moore. Whatever. It's lightly country. That's funny. But then we have these second kind of evil called natural evil. And this natural phenomenon that causes pain and suffering. And so these two are the result of having sin in our world. So this is how one author explains it. When we human beings told God to shove off, he partially honored our request. Nature began to revolt. The earth was cursed. Genetic breakdown and diseases began. Pain became a part of the human experience. I feel that every single day in our household. 3 of our children have a rare genetic disorder called phenylketonuria, where their food costs are extremely exorbitant. And so every single day we work through that. How are we going to be able to afford their food? How can we do that? Genesis 3:18 says, because of sin, nature was corrupted and thorns and thistles entered the world. In other words, it's almost as if nature were longing for redemption to take place so things would be set right again. That's the source of disorder and chaos. So let's make one thing super clear before we kind of go on. God is not the author of evil and suffering. It is true that he created a world with the potential for evil and suffering to take place. Why? Because it was the only way that he could create a world with free will so that the greatest value of love could be experienced by you and I. Some people say, couldn't God have foreseen that this was going to happen? That people would rebel against him? Couldn't he have seen that in advance? The answer is of course. So why did he go ahead and create those things? It's like being a parent. You knew before your child that there was going to be a really real possibility that your child would endure suffering in their life, some pains, their hardship, and that they would put you through pain and hardship. But there may have been some disappointments in life, some failures in life. They may even reject you. They may even reject you as a parent, walk away from you and cause great hurt. Yet knowing the very real possibility of that, you went ahead and had kids anyway. Why did you do it? Because you knew that there was the very real possibility that there was a potential for tremendous joy and a loving relationship and a deep meaning in that relationship that you would have with your kids. And the same thing is true with God. He knew that we would rebel against him, but he also knew that many people would choose to follow him, would choose to love him, would choose to spend eternity with him in heaven. And it was worth all of it for those people, even though it meant the suffering that Jesus had to endure on the cross. But he did that for you and I. I love what Tim Keller says about this. And I'm gonna put in my Next Steps email on Tuesday a couple of incredible books about pain and suffering. But Tim Keller says, you really don't know Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. It's so true. On Christmas Day 1995, I hugged my grandma Raitz and I left. My girlfriend and I were traveling to Minneapolis for a youth conference, and we left, and it's kind of a crazy journey to get there, but we had to go through the state of Wisconsin. At one point, I was listening to worship music. My girlfriend was sleeping. I was driving her Ford Ranger. I looked up, and I realized there was 5 Wisconsin state police officers trying to pull me over. I had the music on so loud. I was worshiping Jesus, and at the same time, I was speeding like crazy. And so they pulled me over, and they're like, do you know how fast you were going? And I'm like, I was going as fast as the Lord sent me. The joy of the Lord is in me. Trading my sorrows. Saying, yes, Lord, yes, Lord. Yes, yes, Lord. I love that song. Remember that song? I'm trading my sorrows. I'm trading my shame. Yeah, that's it. I'm laying them down for the joy of the Lord. I love that. I had the motions. Come on, I've spoke at hundreds of youth camps. I know every motion to every worship song in the history of motions. I'm saying, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord. I don't know where that came from. First experience did not get the yes, Lord. But I got pulled over. They pulled me out of the car. My hands are on the side of it. They're like, do you know how fast you're going? I'm not telling you how fast I was going. I'm telling you, though, that I had to post bond for my license on the side of the road. And I wasn't allowed to drive in the state of Wisconsin for 5 years. So it was kind of a rough deal. But we went to this youth conference, and we had a great time, and then we came home. And when I came home, I had started at a new job as a youth pastor, but I was still working at my other job, which I was a cook at this restaurant called Mountain Jack's. And it was the lunch rush, and my chef's like, Jason, you have a phone call? I'm like, I can't, it's a lunch rush. I'm cooking, and he's like, no, you need to go take this. And so I went to the manager's office, and I picked up the phone, and it was my little brother on the phone. And what was I in 96? I would have been 20. So he would have been 15, and my brother was just hysterical, and I couldn't really make out what he has said, but I thought he said something about our grandma, and so I told my chef I need to go home, and I raced home, and I walked into our house, and it was more than 23 years ago. I still remember it to this day. My dad was leaning up against the kitchen sink with his hands in his face, and he was crying, which was extremely rare because I think it was the first time in my entire life I saw my dad cry. And my mom had her arms folded and her head against the wall, and she was crying. And that day we found out that my grandmother, her sister, and a cousin were all killed in a car accident that morning. And so there are consequences when people run red lights. And I'm going to show you a picture. This was actually the consequence. It was horrendous. Most of my cousins found out by watching the 12 o'clock news. They were 30 seconds away from work. And they were driving, and somebody with a license that was suspended ran through a red light and hit the truck just right, and it just flew 25 feet and flipped upside down and landed upside down, and my grandma, her sister, and a cousin were all killed instantly. And it was 23 years ago, and it still feels heavy and raw and painful. And tragedy and grief and pain and suffering, they rob you of life. Tim Keller says, suffering is unbearable if you aren't certain that God is for you and with you. And believe it or not, though suffering isn't good, God can use it to accomplish good. Peter Kraft put it this way: what's the meaning and purpose of suffering in history? The meaning and purpose of suffering in history is that it leads to repentance. Only after suffering, only after disaster did Israel and individuals turn back to God. Like suffering can bring repentance. Suffering can draw us back to God. C.S. Lewis actually puts it this way: God whispers to us in our pleasure. He speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And many of you know that's exactly true in your experience. It's true in my experience. If you're going through times in your life when everything is going great, the sun is shining, the money is rolling in, the marriage is wonderful, the job's great, it's in those seasons that we're less likely to turn to God. But when there is pain, when suffering comes, when heartbreak takes place, what's the first thing we do? We get on our knees and we cry out, God, help me. I need you. I want you. Lead my life. Help me in this situation. I was on the phone with Dr. Tom and we were talking through this, and he just said something off the cuff, and I'm like, oh, I need to write that down. He said, God is the one who redeems suffering by suffering with us and for us. See, where is God in the midst of suffering? He's right here with us. He does not leave. He does not walk away from you. He is suffering with you, right next to you. And it's a radical statement that we should never forget. 2 Corinthians 7:10 says, for God sometimes uses sorrow in our lives to help us turn away from sin and seek eternal life. We should never regret his sending it. Sometimes God uses that pain and that sorrow. Our suffering will pale in comparison to what God has in store for his followers. My grandmother was a fully devoted follower of Jesus. That woman didn't miss church even if there was a snow apocalypse. Man, she would have been, both of her lungs would have fallen off, and she would have been at church setting up the coffee table, because that's just, she loved God, she loved Jesus, she loved her church. And what happened in my grandmother's life the moment that her life ended on this planet was that she was in the presence of Jesus. She was in the presence of joy and hope that we can't even imagine because of all the pain that we're suffering here. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Pain and suffering hurt. But Paul says in 2 Corinthians, for these light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all.